Okay, in this video, I'm going to go into something that's going to become more needed as we get into object-oriented coding. And it's not really related to it, but it gets into play with the constructors, which we'll get into later, so it's a good time to bring it up. And most programming languages allow, maybe not most, but many programming languages allow methods to be overloaded. And let's talk about what this means. Overloading means if I have a method, let's say I'm going to create a method that displays something to the screen. And the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to display a character to the screen, right? So I'm going to say, in this method, I'm going to say the character the character is, right? And I'm going to print out, the character. Okay, very simple. I don't know when we would use this, but it's called disp. And so now if I had, if I wanted to display a character, I could call my display and pass it a character like A, right? And when I run this code, it's going to take the character A, right? And it's going to call this method disp, and it's going to print the character is A, right? And if I run this, right, code, the character is A. Now to overload a method, what that means is I'm going to create a method with the same exact name as this method, but it's going to accept a different argument or a different parameter. So there's three primary ways of overloading a method. The first one is, I'm going to copy and paste this, right, for now, is to create a method disp with a different type of parameter. And now I'm going to print out, the integer is, and I'm going to print out I. So I have two different methods. They have the same name, but if you notice, this one takes a character and this one takes an integer. So when I call this method, Java is going to look at what type the argument is. And depending on what type the argument is, it's going to call either this method or this method. So since I'm calling disp with a character, it's going to call this method. So if I run this code, right, it's going to say the character is A. If I change this, and pass it a number like 99, now Java's going to recognize that I'm passing an integer and it's going to call this method, right? So if I run this, the integer is 99. And this is really powerful because now to the end user, they can have one method, that's going to display something. And based on what they pass it, it's going to call one of many different methods here, right? I could have another one, public static void disp, and I could pass it a string, for instance, string s, right? And I could say the string is, s. And now if I pass it, hello there, right, which is a string, it's going to call this third variance of disp, and it's going to say the string is hello there. So the first way that you can differentiate methods is by the type of parameter that it accepts, right? Because that's easy for it to distinguish. The second way we can do this is I could have a different number of arguments passed. So for instance, I could take another one here, public disp. It could accept maybe a character and, right, an integer, int I, right? So now, if I call this one needs a character, right, like A, and a number, an integer, right, 99, right? So now it's going to differentiate between all these methods by the number of arguments that are accepted. So this one accepts 2 arguments, right? And this is the only one I created that accepts 2 arguments, so it's going to print this one, right? So I can enhance this. And the integer is, right, plus I. So now this call is going to call this one because it's the only one that accepts 2 arguments, right? So it, as you can see, it did call this one. And the third way, so the first way is the different types of arguments that are accepted. That's one way of differentiating. The second way is the number of arguments that are accepted. And the third way to overload is kind of the sequence of them. So for instance, I could take this method, and this still accepts 2 arguments, but I could take, right, the first one, I could change it, you know, a char and an int. I can make this a string and an int, and then that would differentiate. Or if it was still an int and a char, I could change the order of them, right? So I could say, you know, an int gets passed first, and then a char gets passed second, and, you know, just to know we're in the second one, you know, second disp, right? And now if I call this, it's going to call the first one because the first argument is a char and the second is int. If I run this, it's still going to call that first one, right? But if I change the order here, right, if I say 99, comma that, now Java's going to know that to call this one because in this case, the first one's an int and the second one is a char. So again, you can overload methods, meaning you have the same method name, but the arguments are different. So for instance, the first way we did it was we created one with that accepted a char, and then we accepted one with an int, so that differentiated. Then we created one that accepted 2 arguments instead of 1, and then Java knew by that there were 2 arguments. Then the third way was we actually, you know, had multiple different number of arguments, but then we specified different types for the arguments, and Java would know that way. Likewise, I could have, you know, a disp that takes nothing, right? Static void disp that takes no arguments, and I could just print out, hey, you didn't pass anything. And now, you know, this won't affect anything if I run this because it has arguments, but if I now call disp with nothing, it's going to know to call to this one. So overloading methods is extremely useful for the user who's using the methods, because if I wanted to display an integer, right, I could just pass an integer here, right, 9. If I want to display a string, I could just pass a string here, right, string, string, string. And I still call the same method. If I couldn't overload methods, then I'd be forced to have a method called display integer, and a method called display string, and a method called display char and int, right? And then the user would have to know all those method names when it's making a call, right? And this is similar to the way printline works, right? When I call printline, I can pass it a char and it works. I can pass it a string. I can pass it an int. And it works because they're overloading the methods.